What if I told you the most terrifying encounter of my life didn't take place in a haunted asylum, a cursed forest, or some forgotten graveyard, but right in my own backyard on what began as an ordinary Tuesday night? My name is Marcus, and 3 months ago something happened that ripped apart my carefully constructed view of the world. I had always believed monsters belonged in stories, in horror movies, in the imaginations of people who wanted their lives to be more exciting than they really were. But tonight, I'm here to tell you that they are real. They exist. And I met one. It was September 15th. I remember the date because it was the night before my 32nd birthday, and I'd been planning nothing more exciting than a quiet evening at home. I had work in the morning, and a few friends were coming over the next day for a small celebration. Just a simple dinner, some drinks, nothing out of the ordinary. Looking back, it feels almost cruel how normal the day was, like the world was setting me up for a fall. The weather was strange for mid-September in Ohio. The air carried a damp chill that crept into the bones, and a thick fog rolled in from Lake Erie just after sunset. It blanketed my street in gray, so dense that the glow of the street lamps looked weak, as though the fog itself was devouring the light. My neighborhood, usually quiet but not unsettling, suddenly looked like a set from an old horror film. It should have been a warning that I lived alone in a modest two-story house I'd inherited from my grandmother. She had always been a little unusual. When I was younger, she'd told me stories about things in the woods, things that didn't like to be disturbed. Goblins, she called them. Not the mischievous tricksters from fairy tales, but something older, darker. I'd laughed them off as folklore. After all, I was a rational man, a software developer by trade. My world was made of logic, not superstition. That night, around 11 o'clock, I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes from dinner. The fog pressed against the window over the sink, a shifting gray curtain. That was when I first heard it, a faint scratching noise from outside. At first it was irregular, like claws or fingernails, scraping against wood. I froze, listening. My house bordered a stretch of trees, so my first thought was raccoons, maybe a stray cat. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Animals wander, and old sheds creak. Still, something about the sound unsettled me. It went on for several minutes before cutting off as abruptly as it had started. That silence was worse than the scratching. It felt heavy, expectant, as though something was waiting. I tried to laugh it off, but unease settled in my stomach like a stone. I turned off the lights and went upstairs, telling myself I'd feel better once I was in bed. By midnight, I was propped up with my laptop, half watching a show on Netflix. The fog outside had only thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing. That's when the scratching returned. This time, it wasn't random. It was steady, rhythmic, like a pattern being tapped out on the wood. My show's dialogue faded into nothing as I muted the sound and listened. The noise was coming from my backyard, near the old tool shed. That shed was ancient, built decades ago by my grandfather. The wood was warped, the hinges rusted, and I rarely went inside except to grab tools. My grandmother had always insisted I keep it locked, though she'd never given a clear reason. She used to mutter about unwanted visitors and things that linger where they shouldn't. At the time, I thought she meant animals or drifters. But in that moment, her words came back to me with a weight they'd never carried before. My pulse quickened. I sat there in the dark bedroom, staring at the window. Every part of me wanted to pull the blankets over my head and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity, maybe even stubborn pride, pushed against my fear. What if it really was just an animal? What if it was a raccoon tearing up the siding, or a neighbor's pet getting into trouble? I swung my legs out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. My hands trembled as I clicked it on and off, testing the beam. A small, weak circle of light, barely enough to see through the fog. I told myself I'd just go outside, take one quick look, and if it was nothing, I'd come back in and forget about it. But as I reached the top of the stairs, something shifted in the house. Not physically, but atmospherically. The silence felt deeper, heavier. The kind of silence that presses in on you until you swear you can hear your own heartbeat echoing through the walls. I gripped the flashlight tighter and forced myself down each step. When I opened the back door, the cold air rushed in like a warning. The fog was thicker than I'd imagined, swallowing the backyard whole. I stepped onto the porch, breath clouding in the air, and listened. The scratching had stopped again, but now I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong in the natural world. A low, guttural whisper, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And with that sound curling in my ears, I stepped off the porch and into the fog. The air outside hit me like ice water. It wasn't just the cold, it was the weight of it. The fog clung to my skin like damp cloth, heavy and oppressive, muffling even the smallest sounds. My flashlight beam carved a weak path through the mist, but everything beyond that circle was swallowed whole. The backyard I knew so well felt alien, unrecognizable, like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. I paused on the porch, listening. The scratching was gone, but that new sound, the whisper, still lingered. It was faint, low, almost like a growl buried beneath layers of static. Yet there was something unmistakably deliberate about it. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the creak of settling wood. It felt spoken, but the words weren't anything I could understand. They weren't even words, not in the human sense. I wanted to retreat, to slam the door and lock it behind me, but my feet carried me forward as though I was being pulled. The grass was slick with dew, crunching under my shoes. Each step echoed louder than it should have in the unnatural silence. The tool shed loomed ahead, just a faint shadow through the fog. My grandmother's voice whispered in my memory, "Keep it locked. Don't give them a way in." I remembered laughing at her old stories. Tales of goblins, things that lived in the cracks between worlds. Ridiculous folklore. But as I drew closer, the laughter I'd once had for her warnings curdled into dread. I stopped halfway across the yard, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The fog wasn't just hiding things, it was moving. I swear I saw it shift, swirl, as if something invisible was stirring it from within. My flashlight beam flickered over the haze, and for an instant, I thought I saw a shape dart between the trees at the edge of my property. Too quick to be clear. Too tall to be an animal. My pulse hammered in my ears. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "Just your imagination. Just fog and shadows." But then the whispering grew louder. Still indistinct, but layered now, as though more than one voice was speaking at once. The sound surrounded me, circling, slipping in and out of hearing. Each murmur brushed against the inside of my skull, leaving behind a faint chill, like icy fingers dragging across my thoughts. I forced myself forward, each step heavier than the last. The shed was just ahead now. Its weathered wood was damp with mist, the lock hanging crooked on its latch. And then, it happened. The fog in front of me split apart, peeled back like a curtain. And crouched in that sudden clearing was the thing that would come to haunt every moment of my life thereafter. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It was the size of a dog, maybe a little larger, but its shape was grotesquely wrong. Limbs too long and thin, bent at angles that defied nature. The fingers, because they were fingers, not paws, were tipped with claws that glistened black in the weak beam of my flashlight. Its skin looked like mottled tree bark, gray-green and rough, but with a sickly sheen that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. And then its head. God, that head. Oversized, ears pointed and twitching independently like a bat's, swiveling toward sounds I couldn't hear. But it was the eyes that locked me in place. Two pools of absolute blackness, depthless and ancient. Eyes that didn't just look at me, but through me. We stared at each other, frozen in that silent clearing. My throat went dry, my breath shallow. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. It wasn't just fear, it was something else. Like those black eyes had hooked into me, rooting me to the spot. Then, impossibly, its mouth stretched into a smile. Too wide, too sharp. Rows of jagged teeth, small and numerous, glistening with dark saliva. A thin line of liquid dripped down its chin, hissing faintly when it hit the grass. And then, it spoke. Not out loud, not in any language I recognized, but directly into my head. A cold, slithering whisper that bypassed my ears and went straight to my thoughts. "Do you want to play?" The words weren't just heard. They were felt, like shards of ice piercing the inside of my skull. My body locked. My heart thundered against my ribs, desperate to escape. I wanted to scream, to bolt, but I couldn't. The thing's gaze held me, paralyzed me. The creature shifted, rising slowly to its full height. 4 feet tall, maybe a little more, but its presence filled the yard like a shadow stretching impossibly far. It tilted its head, studying me, as though I were the curiosity here. Its 2 long fingers scraped lines into the damp grass as it began to move. Not walking, not crawling, something between the two. Its movements were jerky and fluid at once, like a puppet guided by invisible strings. The fog coiled around it, swirling with each step, and the smell hit me. Rotting leaves mixed with something chemical, sulfurous. The stench of something that did not belong in this world. It crept closer, closer, that inhuman smile widening. Those black eyes never breaking from mine. And then, the silence shattered, from somewhere beyond the fog. My neighbor's dog exploded into frantic barking. The sound tore through the paralysis like a lifeline, snapping me back into control. My legs unlocked, and without thinking, I turned and bolted toward the house. Behind me, the whispering voices rose, overlapping into a chaotic chorus. The fog churned, and in the corner of my eye, I saw the creature break into a loping pursuit that I didn't dare look back again. I don't remember my feet touching the ground. One moment I was in the middle of my backyard, the creature's black eyes searing into mine, and the next I was stumbling up the porch steps, slamming through the back door with all the strength I could muster. The door banged shut, rattling the frame, and I threw the deadbolt home with shaking hands. For a second, I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. Heart hammering so violently I thought it might break free from my chest. My legs trembled beneath me, my fingers numb. Then I heard it, the first sound of pursuit. A scratching noise at the door, light at first, testing, then stronger, faster, as if those claws were raking against the wood itself. I staggered backward, eyes fixed on the door. Each scrape reverberated through my bones. The rational part of me, small, faint, nearly drowned by panic, told me that locks and deadbolts shouldn't matter to something like that. But in that moment, the barrier was the only thing between me and whatever waited in the fog that I ran through the house, securing every lock, pulling curtains shut with jerks so violent they nearly tore. Windows, front door, side door, everything sealed tight. Yet even as I did, I felt the futility of it. The creature hadn't broken into my house yet, but the way it had spoken inside my head told me it didn't need doors. I ended up in the living room, pressing my back against the wall, flashlight still clutched in one trembling hand. I killed the beam, not wanting to advertise my location. The house fell into darkness, the only sound the ragged rhythm of my own breath. Then came the footsteps, not on the porch this time, but above me, on the roof. Slow, deliberate steps, crossing from one end of the house to the other. Each creak of the shingles sent shivers crawling up my spine. Then silence, followed by scratching at the windows. First the kitchen, then the den, then the one directly across from where I sat. I froze, holding my breath. From the other side of the curtain came the faintest rasp, like nails dragging in slow circles against glass. The sound was unbearably intimate, like it knew exactly where I was, as if it was drawing its presence out deliberately, savoring my fear. And then, the whispering again. Not one voice this time. Many. A chorus, low and guttural, circling the house. The words still made no sense, yet the intent was clear. They weren't just speaking. They were deciding that I press my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't sounds carried by air. They burrowed straight into my thoughts. I squeezed my eyes shut, rocking slightly, trying to drown them out. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. My head snapped up. The front door handle twisted violently, metal groaning, as though someone, or something, was testing its strength. The deadbolt held, but the sound alone nearly broke me. I imagined the creature standing there, smiling that jagged smile, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know how long it went on. Minutes? Hours? My sense of time fractured under the weight of fear. At one point, I must have dozed off in the chair, exhaustion dragging me under despite my best efforts. When I startled awake, the room was eerily silent. No footsteps, no scratching, no whispers, just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the kind of normal sound I hadn't realized I missed until that moment. I stayed frozen, straining my ears. Nothing. The quiet was so complete it felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Dawn eventually crept through the slits in the curtains. Pale light cut across the floor, and only then did I find the courage to stand. Every muscle ached, stiff from fear and tension, but I forced myself to move that I unbolted the back door and stepped outside. The fog had lifted, leaving behind the familiar sight of my backyard. The grass sparkled with dew. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. For a fleeting second, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Then I saw the shed. Its wooden panels were scarred with deep gouges, claw marks that cut not just randomly but deliberately. They formed crude shapes, lines intersecting into symbols I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped, and in the grass, just where I'd seen the creature crouching, was a perfect circle of dead earth. The grass was blackened, brittle, as if burned by something corrosive. Most disturbing of all were the footprints. They started near the shed, moved across the yard, and stopped at the back porch, then circled the entire house. Not once, but many times that I crouched, staring at them. The prints were humanoid, almost, but wrong. Toes stretched long, claw-tipped, the heel narrow and deep like it carried more weight on the front than the back. I snapped pictures with my phone, though even as I did it, I knew no one would believe me. That night had been real. Terrifyingly, undeniably real. And as I stared at those clawed footprints circling my house, one thought lodged itself in my mind. Colder than the fog, sharper than the claws. It hadn't left that IT was waiting. By the time the sun was fully up, I was sitting at my kitchen table, phone in one hand, coffee in the other, staring blankly at the clawed symbols carved into the shed through the window. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling that the thing, or things, were still close. Watching, waiting. The photographs on my phone felt like evidence, but at the same time, they were useless. Who would I show them to? The police? My neighbors? What could I possibly say? Hi, I think goblins are scratching at my shed at night. Can you send someone? They'd laugh. Or worse, they'd think I'd lost my mind. But those marks weren't random. I knew that much. They looked deliberate, purposeful, like language. The longer I stared at them, the stronger that realization became. They weren't the mindless scratches of an animal. They were messages that I opened my laptop, fingers fumbling over the keyboard as I typed every search I could think of. Goblin claw marks. Strange forest symbols. Folklore symbols yard shed. Most of what came back was nonsense. Blog posts about fantasy novels. Gamers arguing over monsters, or touristy websites about old European myths. But buried deep, on a forgotten forum that looked like it hadn't been updated in years, I found something that froze me cold. The thread was titled, The Great-In. The poster described a series of encounters in rural Pennsylvania. Small, twisted figures moving through fog, whispering in voices that weren't human. The description of their claws, long, bony, tipped in black, matched exactly what I'd seen. One photo they'd uploaded showed a wooden fence marked with strange symbols, nearly identical to those on my shed. According to the post, the marks weren't random, they were warnings. Territorial signs. The Graken marked what they considered claimed. And once something was claimed, they didn't give it up. That I sat there, staring at the screen, the words sinking into me like ice water. They don't leave. They linger. They test. And eventually, they take. I slammed the laptop shut, heart racing. The day dragged on in a haze. I try to keep busy. Dishes, laundry, anything to distract myself. But every creak of the house made me flinch. The woods outside seemed too quiet, as though the birds themselves had decided to stay away. By evening, I was pacing the living room, torn between leaving the house forever or trying to fight back. But how do you fight something like that? When the sun went down, the fear returned full force. I closed the curtains tight, checked the locks twice over, then sat with my flashlight and a kitchen knife beside me. At first, nothing happened. Hours passed in silence, and I almost began to believe the night would pass uneventfully. Then came the first sound, a soft tapping on the window pane. Not claws this time. Fingers. Slow. Rhythmic. I held my breath, staring at the curtain. The tapping continued, steady, patient, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. When I didn't move, the sound shifted, scraping now, long, deliberate strokes across the glass. The whispers returned, threading through my skull. This time, I thought I could almost make out words. Not in English, not in any language I knew, but with a cadence that suggested intent. A summons, an invitation. I pressed my hands against my ears, shaking my head, whispering to myself, "It's not real. It's not real." But my own voice sounded hollow. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Then, footsteps in the hallway. Inside the house, my blood turned to ice. I gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. I hadn't heard a door open, hadn't heard glass break, but the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps on the wooden floor, moving closer. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. No answer. Just the soft creak of the next step. I raised the flashlight, thumb hovering over the switch, knife trembling in my other hand. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room doorway. My heart pounded in my throat. I flicked the beam on. The doorway was empty. The hall stretched out in silence. Nothing there. But the floorboards still groaned, as though weight was pressing down on them. Invisible. Heavy. Moving closer. The whispers surged, overlapping in a chorus that grew louder, harsher, until I thought my skull would split open. I staggered backward, the flashlight shaking wildly. The air itself felt charged, thick, as though the walls were closing in. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The whispers, the footsteps, the weight in the air, all gone. The silence returned, heavy and unnatural. I stood frozen, every muscle screaming to move, but too terrified to take a step. My eyes darted across the room, every shadow suddenly too deep, every corner a possible hiding place. That's when I saw it. On the wall opposite me, carved deep into the plaster, was the same symbol I'd seen on the shed. Fresh, the groove still rough. The white dust scattered on the floor beneath it. The Graykin hadn't just circled my house. They were inside. I stared at the symbol carved into my wall, its jagged lines catching the glow of my flashlight. It hadn't been there before. Something had drawn it while I was sitting in that very room. My stomach clenched as the realization hit. I wasn't just being watched anymore. My home, the one place I thought I could barricade myself, was no longer mine. The knife slipped in my sweaty grip. I adjusted it, trying to convince myself it was more than a useless piece of steel against something that could appear and vanish at will. My breath came shallow, ragged, every nerve in my body stretched to breaking. I wanted to run, to bolt through the front door and never look back, but the thought of stepping into that fog-filled yard again froze me in place. At least inside, I had walls, however thin, that separated me from the darkness. I forced myself into motion. One step, then another, edging toward the hallway where the phantom footsteps had sounded. The flashlight beam jittered with each tremor of my hand, throwing frantic shadows along the plaster. The house, once familiar, now felt distorted, too long, too narrow, every corner holding the weight of unseen eyes. When I reached the hallway, I swept the light from one end to the other. Nothing, but the air was different, denser, as if invisible smoke clung to the walls. I stepped forward, and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the beam. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint, chemical, like sulfur mixed with rotting leaves. It clung to the air, thick and oily, making me gag. The whispers started again. Not outside this time, not circling the house. Inside. Close. They echoed down the hall, bouncing from wall to wall until I couldn't tell where they came from. One phrase broke through the incomprehensible murmurs, clear enough to twist my insides. "You are marked." The words burrowed into me, cold and absolute. I staggered back, flashlight shaking. My skin prickled, every hair rising. As though unseen hands brushed against me, I backed into the living room, and nearly dropped the light when I saw the new marks. They weren't just on the wall anymore. Symbols had appeared on the floor, etched into the wood in long, curling strokes. They formed a circle. No, not a circle, something more complex, jagged angles woven into a pattern that made my head ache if I stared too long. That I realized then. This wasn't random intrusion. This was ritual. The Graykin weren't scratching for fun. They were preparing something. Preparing me. The house groaned suddenly, as though something heavy pressed against its frame. The lights flickered overhead. The whispers rose to a fevered pitch, rattling inside my skull. I clutched my ears, but it did nothing. Stop, I shouted. My own voice sounded weak against the chorus. The symbols glowed faintly in response, a sickly greenish light seeping from the grooves. My heart lurched. Whatever they were doing, it was building, gaining strength. Panic surged. I bolted to the kitchen, tearing drawers open, grabbing salt, garlic, anything I half remembered from old stories. I didn't believe in that kind of folklore, not until last night, but belief didn't matter anymore. I had nothing else. I poured salt across the living room doorway, my hands trembling so badly I spilled half of it. The glow from the symbols pulsed, brighter now, throbbing like a heartbeat. The air pressed against me, heavy, suffocating. From the corner of the room came movement. At first, just a ripple in the shadows, then a form beginning to emerge. Thin limbs stretching, bending at impossible angles. Fingers scratching lazily against the wall as if savoring the reveal. That IT stepped halfway into the light. The same jagged smile spread across its too wide mouth. Those black, depthless eyes locked on mine. The salt line hissed faintly, smoking where the creature drew near. It tilted its head, curious, almost amused, then whispered again, not in my head this time, but aloud, its voice like dry leaves crushed underfoot. You can't keep us out. The floorboards vibrated under my feet, symbols flaring brighter. The circle was nearly complete. I didn't know what would happen when it finished, but every fiber of my being screamed that it would mean the end of me. That I lunged forward, grabbing a chair and hurling it across the room. It crashed into the wall, splintering, scattering dust across the glowing marks. For a moment, the light faltered. The whispers shrieked in unison, enraged. The creature recoiled, its body jerking in unnatural spasms. Its smile twisted into a snarl. Then, with terrifying speed, it lunged at me. I stumbled backward, barely clearing the salt line as its claws slashed through the air, inches from my face. Sparks hissed where its hand struck the invisible barrier. The creature shrieked, retreating into the shadows, but the damage was done. The symbols reignited, brighter, fiercer, the house trembling with the force of it. The ritual wasn't broken. It was accelerating, and then I heard it. Not just whispers, but something deeper, louder, rising beneath the floorboards. A voice far older, far hungrier. Whatever the Graykin had been preparing for wasn't about to begin. That IT already had. The sound beneath the floor was no longer just a whisper. It was a growl. A deep, resonant vibration that rattled dishes in the cupboards and set the glass in the windows humming. My whole body trembled with it. It wasn't merely noise. It was presence, something massive stirring in the dark spaces beneath the house. The glowing symbols on the floor pulsed in time with the sound. Brighter and brighter until the sickly green light washed across the entire living room. I tried to back away, but the air had thickened, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. Every movement was a struggle, as though the house itself had turned against me. The Graykin emerged again, not one but three this time, crawling out of the shadows like spiders uncoiling their limbs. Their bodies bent unnaturally, limbs too long for their frames, claws clicking against the walls as they circled the glowing ritual. Their eyes were bottomless voids, reflecting nothing, swallowing everything. They didn't attack me. Not yet. They moved around the markings with reverence, each step deliberate, as though they were guardians ensuring nothing disturbed the ritual. That I gripped the knife tighter, though I knew it was pointless. The salt line still hissed faintly at my feet, keeping them from lunging directly at me, but it felt temporary, fragile. They weren't concerned with me. Their attention was on the circle, on what was coming. The sound beneath the floor grew louder, shifting into something that made my stomach twist. It was language, though not human. A chorus of guttural syllables that rose and fell like waves, ancient and alien. Each word seemed to vibrate inside my bones, threatening to shake me apart from the inside that I stumbled toward the kitchen, desperate for anything. Holy water, iron, anything that might slow this down. My grandmother's voice came back to me, warnings I'd dismissed as stories for children. They come through the cracks. They mark what is theirs. Don't let them finish the calling. Finish the calling. That's what this was. A summoning. I grabbed a pot of salt and hurled it at the circle. For a split second, hope flared. The grain scattered across the glowing lines, and the light faltered. The house itself seemed to shudder in pain. The Graken shrieked. Their voices cut through the air like broken glass, furious and wild. One of them lunged, slamming against the invisible barrier of the salt line at my feet, its claws inches from my leg. Sparks hissed where it struck, the smell of burning wood and rot filling the air. The glow dimmed, but only for a moment. Slowly, inexorably, the symbols reignited, stronger than before, as if fueled by my resistance. The chorus below deepened, swelling with renewed force. The Graken tilted their heads toward me in unison, their jagged smiles widening. One whispered aloud, its voice high and thin, like a knife scraping bone, "You cannot stop it. You are the offering." The words lodged in my chest like shards of ice. Offering. The realization hit hard. They weren't summoning for themselves. They were summoning for something else. Something that demanded sacrifice. The floorboards began to crack. Long fissures split the wood, widening with each pulse of light. The smell that poured out was unbearable: sulfur, decay, wet earth. A dark mist seeped upward, curling around my legs, dragging the warmth from my skin. I panicked. Dropping the knife, I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fire poker from the hearth, and swung it down into the glowing lines. Sparks flew, wood splintered. The light sputtered violently. The Graken shrieked again, clawing at the air, their forms twitching with fury. For a moment, I thought I'd broken it. The chanting faltered. The ground stilled. Then, in the silence, a new sound rose out of breath. Long, slow, deliberate, drawn from beneath the house, as though something massive had just inhaled. The kind of breath you take before opening your eyes for the first time in ages. The cracks widened further. A hand, or what looked like one, emerged from the floor. But it wasn't flesh. It was black, slick, glistening, with too many joints and fingers that curled backward as much as forward. It gripped the edge of the broken wood, pulling upward. The Graken fell silent, bowing their heads low, their claws pressed to the ground in reverence. I stumbled backward, while rising in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt rooted, like the ritual itself had ensnared me. The hand gripped tighter, splintering the wood as easily as paper. Another breath shook the room, followed by a low rumble that rattled the walls. And then, a voice deeper than anything I had ever heard filled the house. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was thunder inside my skull, vast and inescapable at last. The door is open, the floor buckled. The circle blazed like fire. The Graken lifted their heads, grinning, and from the widening crack beneath my house, something began to rise. The floor didn't just crack, it caved in. Splinters of wood snapped upward like jagged teeth, leaving a jagged maw in the center of my living room. From it, the fog surged upward in thick, writhing tendrils, alive in a way that fog had no business being. My flashlight beam couldn't pierce it. It only reflected, swallowed instantly like a drop of water in black ink. The hand, or claw, wasn't alone anymore. Another followed, pulling against the foundation as though something enormous was forcing itself into a space far too small for it. The walls groaned. The ceiling creaked. I half expected the entire house to collapse into the ground, and then I saw its head. It emerged slowly, unnaturally, like it wasn't climbing but sliding into existence. A shape of glistening black, slick like oil, with features that refused to stay still. One moment its face was skeletal, the next it was nothing but shifting shadows. But its eyes, if they could be called eyes, remained constant. Two vast, burning voids, deeper than the night sky, staring straight into me. The Graken dropped to their knees in unison, claws pressed flat to the glowing symbols. Their bodies twitched in ecstasy, like worshippers witnessing the return of their god. One of them began to chant in that broken, guttural language, and the others joined in. The sound made my teeth ache. I couldn't breathe. The thing hadn't fully stepped through yet, but the weight of its presence was unbearable. It pressed against my mind like a storm front, flooding me with thoughts that weren't mine. Fragments of memory, voices not my own, images of places that didn't exist on any map I'd ever seen. A barren wasteland beneath a sky that pulsed like living flesh. Forests of twisted, skeletal trees whose branches dripped black ichor. And in the distance, always in the distance, more of those things, waiting that it wasn't just entering my house. It was bringing its world with it. The Graken rose again, their bodies swaying like reeds in a poisonous wind. One hissed aloud, high and sharp, "The gate holds. The vessel awaits." The others turned their eyeless faces toward me. My skin went cold. I understood then what they'd meant in earlier nights, when they called me the Chosen. I wasn't just prey. I wasn't just entertainment. I was part of the ritual, the entity, this vast, shifting presence clawing its way up through my house, needed me. My fear, my body, my soul. No, I whispered, though my voice was swallowed by the roar of the summoning. My fingers tightened around the fire poker still in my grip. Useless, ridiculous, but it was the only thing anchoring me to reality, the only weapon I had. The thing's head shifted again, tilting at an impossible angle. A mouth split open where none had been before, stretching far wider than a human face should allow. Rows upon rows of needle-sharp teeth gleamed in the sickly green glow of the circle, and then it spoke. Not like the Graken, not in broken whispers, but in a sound that shattered glass in my cupboards and sent cracks up the walls. "You are the doorway." The words slammed into me like a physical force. My knees buckled, and I hit the floor hard, the fire poker clattering away. My vision blurred. My ears rang. I tasted blood. The bag of salt slipped from my hands, scattering across the tiles in a desperate arc. For a moment, the Graken faltered, their clawed feet skittering back like insects recoiling from flame. The monstrous shape in the pit writhed, its slick black form bulging against the edges of the crack in my living room floor. As if the very world resisted letting it through. I had seconds, maybe less. The fire poker lay on the ground where I dropped it. I lunged for it, fingers closing around the cold metal. It was laughable, swinging iron at things that didn't belong in our world, but I remembered my grandmother's warnings. Iron cuts through the veil. It anchors what shouldn't exist. The Graken shrieked in unison, a chorus of fury and hunger, and leapt. Their movements were wrong, jerky, too fast, as if time itself stuttered around them. One slammed into the invisible line of salt at my feet, sparks flaring where its body touched. It clawed desperately, screeching as smoke rose from its skin, until it pulled back with a howl that rattled the windows. The largest one, the leader I'd first seen at the shed weeks ago, tilted its head and smiled that wide, two-toothed grin. Its voice seeped into my skull, smooth and mocking. "Salt will not save you. The circle is older than you, stronger. It cannot be broken." Maybe it was right. But I wasn't about to lie down and let them take me. I shoved past the counter, swinging the poker wildly, sparks flying where it struck the floor. My target wasn't the creatures themselves, it was the circle. The glowing green lines etched into the wood that pulsed with each heartbeat of the thing below. The first strike landed hard. A deep crack split the nearest symbol, green light sputtering. The house shook violently, as though the foundations themselves protested. The Graken screamed. Not in fear, but in rage. They rushed me, bodies darting across the room like shadows peeling off the walls. One slammed against my shoulder, its claws grazing flesh. Pain seared down my arm, hot and icy all at once. I staggered, but didn't stop. I swung again. The poker smashed through another line. The glow dimmed further. The chanting from below stuttered, breaking rhythm. For an instant, I thought I'd actually done it, stopped the ritual. Then the entity in the pit roared that it wasn't sound, it was force. The blast knocked me from my feet, slammed me into the far wall. My ears rang, blood ran from my nose, and the poker slipped from my hands. The circle blazed brighter than before, every line reigniting, fueled by the rage of whatever writhed beneath the house. The Graken advanced, their movements slower now, deliberate. They didn't rush me again. They stalked, confident, because the circle was healing itself. No, I gasped, crawling toward the broken section of floor. My vision blurred, but I saw it. The cracks I'd made hadn't vanished completely. The wood was still splintered. The symbols weakened. It wasn't enough to smash them. I had to erase them to my grandmother's voice came back again, faint, like memory whispered across a great distance. Unmake their words, Marcus. Names bind them. Break the name, break the hold. The symbols weren't just patterns. They were words, language older than anything human. I dragged myself forward, dipping my fingers into the spilled salt, pressing it into the glowing grooves. My skin burned on contact, but the lines hissed, sizzling like water on hot iron. The green light faltered again. The Graken shrieked, claws digging into the floor as they howled in frustration. One lunged, but I hurled the remaining salt in its face. It reeled back, screeching, its skin bubbling as smoke poured from the wounds that I pressed harder, grinding salt into every broken groove, smearing the patterns until they broke apart into meaningless scratches. The effect was instant. The roar from below turned into something else, panic. The great black form jerked violently, one clawed hand slipping back into the crack. The glowing lines dimmed, flickering like dying embers. I forced myself upright, every muscle screaming, and shouted hoarsely, "You don't belong here." My voice cracked, but the words seemed to carry weight. The air itself vibrated with them. The leader snarled, its black eyes boring into mine. "You are ours. You cannot close what has been opened." But even as it spoke, the circle continued to falter. One by one, the lines of green light guttered out, leaving only faint scratches in the ruined wood. The chanting from beneath the house stuttered, broke apart, and fell silent. The hand gripping the floor slipped lower, its claws raking furrows in the boards as it was dragged back down. The Graken shrieked in fury, their bodies twisting violently, forms flickering in and out of solidity. And then, in one final desperate act, the leader lunged straight through the fading salt line. Shrieking its hatred, it was willing to burn itself just to reach me before the circle collapsed that I had only one chance to stop it. The Graken leader launched itself at me, its body twisting in impossible angles, claws snapping through the air like jagged lightning. I stumbled backward, barely keeping my balance, fire poker raised in a trembling grip. Every muscle screamed, every nerve burned, but I couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The rest of the Graken had retreated to the edges of the room, their claws digging into the walls, watching, waiting. They weren't attacking anymore. They were witnesses, anticipating failure, or maybe punishment. The leader's black eyes glimmered with malice, unblinking, intelligent, and ancient. It lunged again. I swung the poker upward, aiming for its head, but it twisted midair, laughing in that dry, rasping tone that made the air itself vibrate. The weapon missed by inches. Its claws raked past me, shredding my sleeve, leaving a sting of fire along my arm. Pain, fear, adrenaline. They all combined into a singular clarity. I had to end this before the circle fully collapsed. The symbols on the floor pulsed faintly, green fading to gray as the weakened lines fought to regain their form. Below them, the pit throbbed with something alive, something hungry. The entity had retreated partially, but it was still there, lurking, waiting for the circle to be restored. I had no time to think, only to act. I grabbed a handful of the scattered salt, hurling it at the leader. The particles struck like tiny knives, sizzling as they burned against its oily black skin. The creature shrieked and recoiled, sparks flying where its body met the crystals. This gave me the opening I needed. I dove toward the pit, plunging my hands into the fractured lines of the circle, grinding the remaining salt into the grooves. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes, but I pressed harder. The lines resisted, pulsing faintly, as if fighting to exist, trying to drag me into submission. The leader scrambled toward me, claws extended, teeth bared in that impossible grin. I swung the poker again, catching it across the shoulder. Sparks hissed, and the thing staggered back, shrieking in rage. Its black eyes never left mine, boring through me, trying to force terror into my soul. "I won't let you win," I growled, almost more to myself than to it that I worked faster, pressing salt and iron nails into the grooves, smearing them until the once perfect symbols became fragmented, broken scratches. The circle flickered and pulsed violently, a heartbeat of malevolent energy struggling to survive. The leader screamed, a sound that seemed to split the air, tearing through the walls, rattling the floorboards. It leapt at me one final time, claws extended in a desperate, violent arc. I raised the poker and met it head-on, metal met flesh, or something like it, with a shower of sparks. The creature froze, recoiling, smoke rising from its body. Its screech became a howl of frustration and disbelief. And then, something in the circle changed. The pit shuddered violently, and the green glow collapsed inward, snapping in on itself like a dying star. The massive entity beneath the floor bellowed in rage, a sound so vast it pressed against my chest and made my vision swim. The leader shrieked again, thrown backward by some invisible force. It clawed at the air, twisting violently as if trying to reach through the dissipating energy. Then, with a final, piercing scream, it dissolved into black mist, swirling violently before vanishing entirely. The room went silent. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. My hands were raw from pressing the salt. My arms burned from the scratches, but the oppressive presence was gone. The pit had sealed itself, leaving only splintered wood and faint scorch marks where the ritual had erupted. The remaining Greykin had disappeared. I didn't see them leave. I didn't hear them vanish. They simply weren't there. That I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, shaking, staring at the broken circle, the air still vibrating faintly with residual energy. It was over. Somehow, I had stopped it. The entity had been called back, or banished, or perhaps it had never fully crossed into our world. But whatever it wasn't here anymore. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without fear. Every nerve in my body relaxed, every muscle loosened, though my mind remained alert, scanning shadows and corners for threats. I knew instinctively that the Greykin were gone, but that didn't mean they were defeated. Not entirely. The symbols were broken, the ritual ended, but the warning remained. They had marked me, chosen me, tested me, and even though I had survived, I knew they would remember. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the last time they would come for me. I stood slowly, wincing at every sore joint and raw patch of skin. The living room, the circle, the pit, it was all wreckage now. My home had been violated in ways that couldn't easily be repaired. But somehow, against impossible odds, I had survived. And I had stared into the impossible and come back. And I had the feeling that, if they returned, I would be ready. The house was silent now, almost too silent. No scratching, no whispers, no glowing symbols pulsing with life. Only the remnants of the chaos remained. The splintered floorboards where the ritual had erupted, faint scorch marks, and the lingering smell of sulfur and burnt wood that refused to dissipate. I sat on the living room floor for what felt like hours, staring at the mess, too exhausted to move, too alert to sleep. Even in the daylight, my home didn't feel the same. Shadows clung to corners that had once been ordinary, shifting subtly when I wasn't looking. Every creak of the floor made my stomach twist. My nerves, though frayed to the breaking point, refused to settle. I knew the Greykin weren't gone. They had been forced back, yes, but the way they had watched, calculated, and tested me left no doubt. They were patient. They would return. I began the slow process of cleaning. Boards were reinforced, broken windows repaired, furniture repositioned. I sprinkled salt along the thresholds of every door and window, hung iron implements where I could, and even chalked protective symbols on the walls, half remembering rituals from books and old folklore. It wasn't guaranteed to work, but every precaution gave me a sense of control I desperately needed. Nights were still the hardest. Sleep became a carefully measured act of vigilance. I left lights on, kept weapons within reach, and checked the locks obsessively. The faintest noise would jolt me awake. The rustle of leaves outside, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the wind rattling through the eaves. Every shadow could be a break-in. Every whisper could be the entity from beneath the house, calling, testing. I began recording the nights, setting up cameras in every corner, even pointing one at the patched floor where the ritual had been. Some nights were uneventful, the house quiet except for the natural creaks of an old home. But others, I would catch fleeting shadows, shapes that moved too fast, too fluidly, disappearing when I blinked. Occasionally, the footage would show eyes, tiny, black pinpoints reflecting faint light from the corner of a room. I never got close enough to identify them, and part of me didn't want to damn my understanding of reality had changed irrevocably. I no longer dismissed folklore, dismissed stories of creatures that existed just beyond our perception. I knew firsthand that the world held things far older, far more intelligent, and far more dangerous than I could have imagined. The Greykin, and whatever it was they had tried to bring through, existed in the spaces between our world and another. And they were patient hunters. To cope, I sought out others. I joined forums and private networks dedicated to paranormal encounters, communities of people who had faced what I had and survived. Listening to their experiences, sharing mine in fragments, I realized I wasn't alone. There were others who had stared into the same darkness, who understood the feeling of being hunted, of being marked, and who had taken measures to protect themselves. That connection became a lifeline. Even with support, I couldn't relax entirely. Certain nights, I would feel a presence pressing just outside my home, lingering at the edge of my perception. I could almost feel their eyes on me, analyzing, waiting. The memory of the entity in the pit, the roar, the claws, it stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. I knew I had survived, but survival didn't equal safety. I began keeping a journal again, meticulously recording every sight, every sound, every fleeting shadow. Patterns emerged. Sometimes the Greykin returned on nights of fog, sometimes when the air grew thick with heat or the wind shifted in odd ways. I learned to anticipate their approach and reinforce my defenses in advance. 3 months have passed since that night, and the immediate terror has faded, but never completely. I sleep more, eat normally, and maintain the rituals, but the underlying tension is permanent. My backyard is quiet, my tool shed looks normal, the grass regrowing where the entity had sat, but I know the truth. The Greykin are out there. They are waiting. They are patient. And if they ever return, they will remember me. Asterisk, I tell this story not as proof, not to convince skeptics, but as a warning. There are things in the world that should not be seen. Things that mark, that stalk, that hunt. Fear is their weapon. Vigilance is ours. Survival isn't just a matter of strength. It's a matter of knowledge, preparation, and courage. I remain alert, always ready, always aware. My home is my fortress, my salt, iron, and symbols my shields, and my memories a constant reminder of the night I stared into the impossible and lived. If you ever encounter something that doesn't belong in this world, don't assume it's imagination. Take it seriously. Protect yourself. And above all, never give in to fear, because the Greykin, and things far worse, are patient. And they remember. Until next time, this is Insomnia Stories, reminding you that sometimes the monsters aren't in the dark corners of the forest or the abandoned building. Sometimes they're right outside your window, waiting for you to notice.